Hello, booze and ghouls. It is once again the most magical season of the year, Halloween time. Now, I have lived in Pennsylvania for about 8 years now. And this year I have decided to embrace my current home state's spooky heritage. Pennsylvania has produced a lot of great horror over the centuries, right? From the first Gothic novel written in the United States, Charles Brockden Brown's Wyland, stay tuned for a video about that one, up through, say, the birth of the modern zombie movie with George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. I've already done a video about Night of the Living Dead, but I will have another video coming up about a Romero film this season. And so Pennsylvania has this great heritage of horror, and that's what we're going to talk about this spooky season. In this video, we're going to talk about Irvin Yeaworth Jr.'s film, The Blob. Now, this is one of the sort of classic, iconic 1950s schlock horror movies. It's not all that good. The script is so there's a lot of stuff in the script that feels incomplete. Like, Dr. Hallen and his nurse Kate, when they first encountered the Blob, pretty much immediately jumped to the conclusions that A, it's a living thing, B, it can't be killed, C, it poses a major existential threat to themselves, to Phoenixville and Downington, the two small towns in which this is set, just outside Philly, hence part of the Pennsylvania horror series for 2025. And yeah, so there's a lot of stuff that just feels incomplete, right? Like people just sort of jump to these wild conclusions in ways that are not supported by the evidence available to them. But and also the acting is very wooden and sort of boring. Even the King of Cool, Steve McQueen, can't really save it. Partially probably because he was, I think, almost 30 and was supposed to be playing a 17-year-old. But this was his first major film role, I believe, or his first leading role in a film. And yeah, even Steve McQueen is not all that good in the movie. But what makes The Blob an interesting film is that it is an almost ham-handed artifact of its time. So someone, and I don't know who this was originally, who first sort of used this phrase, but the paranoid culture of 1950s America has been described as aliens in the sky and communists under the bed. And that's quite true in many ways, right? There was a massive UFO scare. There were consistent reports of flying saucers, etc., etc. And of course, this was the height of the Cold War. So we were in the second Red Scare of the 1950s, the period of McCarthyism, where just the accusation of being sympathetic to communism was enough to ruin one's professional career, etc., etc. And in this film, we have small-town America, populated pretty much exclusively by white people, it is worth noting, despite the fact that Philadelphia and probably its surrounding towns are quite heterogeneous. I don't know as much about small towns outside Philly in the 50s. It's possible that they were much more white, but yeah, we've got good, wholesome, small town white Americans. That's our backdrop, and it's of course hard to not see that as ideologically coded on some level. This is a This is a community that seems to sort of embody small town Americana. This is a town of diners. This is a town where there's one doctor who seems to practice out of his house. This is a town where, I mean, even it's got that sort of 1950s moderate edginess of like, this is a town where the teenagers are drag racing, but then the police stop them and give them a stern talking to. Yeah. So into this sort of bucolic small town fantasy enters the Blob. It is an asteroid. An asteroid crashes to Earth. Steve McQueen, playing a character named Steve Andrews, I think is the last name. I kind of hate it when actors play a character that has the same first name as them, because the first time his girlfriend, Jane Martin, was like, "Hey, Steve, we can't go too far kissing up here at Lover's Lane." You're like, shut up, we know it's Steve McQueen. But of course, in 1958, people didn't know it was Steve McQueen because he wasn't yet the king of cool. He wasn't yet a major celebrity who would become an incredibly influential actor. He was some nobody schmuck that nobody had heard of. But again, you entirely take my meaning. So Steve is up there with Jane, and we open on them with the most platonic kiss you possibly could imagine. Like, it is painfully awkward. They literally just have their faces sort of positioned right next to each other, and that is it. And they just hold there for a long time. Like, much longer than a kiss like that should be held. Like, they are clearly not making out, but then again, this is also a movie in which we later see Steve's parents get out of their two separate twin beds. So, 1950s. So they're up there. One hesitates to say making out. They are kissing in the most polite, restrained, waspy way you possibly could. And they see some shooting stars, one of which smacks into the ground relatively close to them. And Steve's like, "Hey, let's go try and find that." And Jane is like, "I'd kind of rather not." And Steve is like, "Well, this is the 1950s, so consent is not that important." That's not really what happens. He sort of says, "Let's go find that." And he's got the car, so the fact that she's not that keen on it doesn't really deter him. But he doesn't say it's the 1950s, and so consent doesn't matter. But that's kind of the vibe. So he takes her off. They go looking for this fallen meteorite. Instead, it's found by a local farmer who pokes it with a stick, as you do. It cracks open, sort of like an egg. And inside is this gelatinous little gelatinous guy, right? And so the farmer naturally pokes that with a stick. And the gelatinous substance inside is like, aha, I'm going to cling to this stick now. And then it sort of climbs up the stick and it engulfs the farmer's hand. And he's like, fuck, this is not a good thing. Why have I made this mistake with my life? And he starts basically freaking out and running around crazy. At one point running into the road and almost getting hit by Steve and Jane, who are like, whoa, what the fuck? That's an old dude. He's fucking screaming and going nuts. We should maybe take him to the doctor, perhaps. So they do that. In Doc Hallen's office, he's like, this is a weird thing on this guy's hand, and it seems to have gotten bigger and more red. They don't have the reference if it was red, but originally it appears to be clear, though it's hard to tell because it's also against a dark background initially. But it's getting redder. See? You see where I'm going with this? So Steve and Jane are dispatched by Dr. Howland to go back up to this dude's house, this farm out in the woods, and see if they can find out who knows him or if there's anything like any clues, basically. Instead of doing that, Steve gets in a pointless drag race with some dudes who it's not 100% clear whether he actually knows them, because they sort of explain that, like, hey man, you drove faster than us on the way into town, and that's not acceptable because I'm the king of drag racing. Now we've got a drag race about it. Which doesn't seem like a thing that you would tell your friend who knows you. But then later, Jane refers to him as their friends, or refers to them as his friends. So it's unclear. Anyway, so they decide they're going to have a drag race. Steve gets pulled over by the police. The police officer, police chief, I think, Dave, is basically just like, hey, I'd prefer if I didn't have to, arrest you for reckless driving. So maybe let's not drag race backwards anymore. And Steve's like, yes, sir, that sounds like an amazing plan. I'm gonna go home and do that right now. Little does Dave know, Steve is not going to go home and do that right now. He's eventually going to make his way back up to this farm, look for clues. Steve and Jane are going to steal this farmer's dog on the premise that there's nobody else at this farm. Farmer is incapacitated. They don't want to leave the dog there. So fair play on that logic, but you're still stealing somebody else's dog without permission. So they take this dog. The dog shows up periodically and then just disappears periodically. Like, it is really not a consistent part of the story. Which in some ways is sad because the dog is one of the best performances. But anyway, back in Dr. Howland's office, the Blob has consumed the entirety of this farmer. Dr. Howland and his nurse Kate observe this, and they're like, fuck, this is a bad thing. Oh no, it's indestructible. There's nothing we can do. And Dr. Howland's like, well, throw some acid on it. No effect. The Blob doesn't give a shit about acid. Then he's like, get my gun. I'll go get my gun. You stay here. Don't get eaten. Oh, you got eaten. Well, I've got my gun. I'm going to shoot the Blob. Blob doesn't care. No fucks given. Blob is like, bullets, whatever. I'm going to eat you. And basically the Blob just sort of moves over this town, seemingly at random, just eating random people. I'm saying eating. I don't know if that's the right actual verb. Sort of absorbing them, coating them in itself, and growing larger. Again, you see where I'm going with this. So this is an alien creature, right? It has arrived from somewhere out in space, presumably. Its origins are unknown, mysterious. It's unknowable in its malignancy. And its entire objective, seemingly, is to just roam around small-town America, gobbling up the good white citizens of this small town. As it gets increasingly more red. It's a fucking heavy-handed metaphor for communism, right? So this was the era of domino theory. I don't know if that term had necessarily emerged yet or had emerged into popular consciousness, as opposed to, say, military and political strategic thinking circles. But domino theory was basically the idea that if one country falls to communism, e.g. Korea or Vietnam, as the sort of prime examples, then all of the countries around them would fall, and eventually the entire world would be swept up under communist regimes. On the one hand, this was obviously a sort of ideologically driven fear tactic that was meant to solidify U.S. opposition to the Soviet Union and to the People's Republic of China, as well as to communist Cuba by this point. On the other hand, this is not inconsistent with some variations of communist doctrine, which sees the revolution as spreading internationally, right? That sees communism as a transnational or international or pan-national movement. But this became a sort of defining feature of 1950s paranoia culture. It was this idea that the Reds are coming, right? That communism is an unstoppable force that cannot be reasoned with, cannot be sort of properly understood or contemplated. It just must be fought with every resource at your disposal. And realistically, it cannot be killed, because that is one of the elements of the Blob, even though they eventually find out that it can't tolerate cold, which of course means that coming to Pennsylvania was not exactly the most strategic of invasion plans, because especially in the 1950s, prior to the really massive upswing in global climate change, global temperature rises in the past, 40 years or so, Pennsylvania got reasonably cold in the winters. So the Blob was not going to do well with that. But the plan basically becomes they're going to hit it with some CO2 fire extinguishers, just chill that motherfucker out. They will basically freeze it. The Air Force will send a transport plane, and they will parachute it into the Arctic. And the film ends with Police Chief Dave being like, well, we couldn't kill it, but it'll stay we couldn't kill it. It's just frozen, but it's going to the Arctic. And Steve is like, then we'll be safe as long as the Arctic stays frozen. So first off, global climate change fucking that shit up, right? The Arctic, temperatures in the Arctic rapidly rising. Stuff is thawing. If the Blob really got dropped up there in 1958, boy howdy, is it probably loving this. But this, of course, is this sort of, right, because Americans, especially at this point, thought of Russia as quite cold, and many parts of Russia are quite cold, right? Siberia is a frozen tundra landscape for much of it, or at least for much of the year, whatever it is. But this sort of idea of like, we can keep the communist menace at bay as long as it's contained to the cold parts of the world, as opposed to Pennsylvania, known for its balmy temps, I guess. So this sort of idea of containment of the red menace that seeks to swallow us up and cannot be reasoned with, cannot be destroyed, cannot be bargained with, cannot be pleaded with, whatever it is. It's simply an unstoppable alien force that seeks to destroy for whatever, the pure joy of destruction or whatever it is. And the fact that, again, the Blob gets increasingly red over the course of the film is a clear indicator that this is meant to stand metaphorically for communism. And again, that's what it comes down to. It's a 1950s film, and it is so clumsily obvious in its anti-communist Cold War presentation.